Hello and welcome back to Book Lust. I'm Nancy Pearl. My guest today is Brad Bigelow, who is both a writer and an editor and an unearther of books that he believes and I believe should be reissued. Brad, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you so much for inviting me, Nancy. This is such a treat.
I was really interested, of course, in your brand new book, Virginia Faulkner, A Life in Two Acts, because in many ways it seems to me that it encapsulates your mission in life. Because Virginia Faulkner, I certainly had never heard of her, and it turns out, when I read the book, that she's this fascinating woman who was seen by many as the next Dorothy Parker. She wrote a novel. She had this fascinating life. And how come I never heard of her? And how did you discover her?
Well, thanks for that. I've been writing about neglected books it's been my passion, honestly. I went to the University of Washington there in Seattle, and I used to cruise up and down the stacks of Susalo Library, which is an amazing world resource, and just pulling out books that I didn't recognize. And through that, I discovered early on, just as an undergraduate, that there were a lot of books in the world that were not the ones that were on the course syllabus and the reading lists or in the surveys. They were not, the recognized great works of literature, but they were still great books, good reading experiences, learning, well written, well crafted, whatever. And they just, didn't have the good luck of getting recognized. So for many years, I kind of was on the hunt and have ever since been looking for these kinds of books. And one that I had heard about, and this is probably almost 20 years ago, was this book called, and it probably doesn't show up well, but it's called My Heyday, which is purported to be the memoirs of a character named Princess Tulip Murphy, as told to Virginia Faulkner. I read this book, and it's become my habit whenever I read a book and I find it, particularly interesting, I will look into a little bit about the author and his or her story. And when I looked at Virginia Faulkner, there was very little reference and material about her, but you do see in one of these kind of assemblages of author biographies that are in the reference sections of a lot of libraries. There's a little, half-page blurb synopsis of her biography, and she went to the school in Rome, she went to Radcliffe, she worked for the Washington Post, she published several novels, she worked for MGM, she had a Broadway show, and then she's an editor in Lincoln, Nebraska at the University of Nebraska Press. And that seemed like such a strange left turn to take in a career. I did no further research at that point, but it always stuck in my head. And when I I retired from NATO and I went to grad school at the University of East Anglia in Norwich, England, in a biography program. And I was looking for subjects. Well, the pandemic hit. And all of these subjects I had been considering that would have required archival research, I had to set aside. So I went back and looked at Virginia Faulkner because a lot of stuff I could find online, and I found people I could contact who were tremendous in sharing material. And I started to realize what an interesting life this was. Over and above the value of her writing, and I think that was sort of one of the breakthroughs that I had in writing this book was it's not a traditional literary biography because I'm not really trying to show how her life illuminated her work. She just had an interesting story. And of course, part of her interesting story was the fact that she sort of had a midlife crisis dealing with her alcoholism and depression, and that is probably some of the reasons why she ended up back in Lincoln, Nebraska. And I think quite remarkably rebuilt her life. And I think that's one of the reasons I wanted to call it A Life in Two Acts is it goes back to the F. Scott Fitzgerald quotation, which was included in The Last Tycoon, about there are no second acts in American lives. And uh, that's simply untrue in the case of Virginia Faulkner. And I think it's particularly relevant in terms of Fitzgerald's use of that, the fact that that was his statement, because he, of course, spiraled into alcoholism, even though he wasn't drinking right at the end, but he ruined his health and he ruined his career because he was an alcoholic. And there were many other writers associated with Hollywood in those days who followed the same trajectory. And instead of going down that path, Virginia Faulkner goes back to Nebraska. She takes a completely, unnoteworthy job. In fact, I quote the line that she tells some writer that, the writer will get at the end of the project, the writer gets his or her name on the cover. The editor just gets older and more tired. Uh, and she devoted she saw the opportunity to bring back numerous writers, and most notably the work of Willa Cather, who she considered to be it was very much her mission to bring Willa Cather back, well, to bring Willa Cather to the level of being recognized as a great world writer.
I didn't know about your degree in biography. What draws you to that?
It's a good question. I think, for one thing, I'm fascinated by other lives. I'm constantly in awe of the choices people make, because life doesn't come with a roadmap or a set of instructions. No matter how many self-help books get published every year, we don't have a map of how to not navigate our way through lives.
Right.
And so I always find it illuminating to see how other people took on these challenges.
Are you thinking about doing another biography, or do you like constantly think about somebody, or?
I have a number of subjects I'd like to deal with. I think that the next book project I'm working on at the moment is sort of more of I don't want to call it a group biography, because a group biography typically implies that there's a groupness to the life. But I am a huge fan of what are known as pre-code movies, the movies that Hollywood produced in the first 5 years of talking pictures, when there was relatively loose enforcement of the morality codes and things like that. And the thing that I'm most fan, there's a lot of stuff written about pre-code movies on the film side, but what no one seems to have drawn attention to is the fact that at that time, when movies went from silent to sound, the studios needed films that they could stuff full of dialogue. And that meant that at that time, they used far more heavily than any time afterwards, they used magazine stories, Broadway plays, and novels. And in many cases, the novels or the writers responsible for those kind of got played up as stars as much as the stars on the screen. And then there was also this period where this was the height of magazine readership in America. The Saturday Evening Post
Right,
and
right.
Liberty and Cosmopolitan and all of these magazines that were coming out every week, stuffed full of short stories and serialized novels. Newspapers were serializing novels. And it's just that sort of ecosystem that was going on at that unique period where I've found cases where writers on the payroll of Hollywood studios wrote novels that got serialized in newspapers just to sort of provide another marketing outlet for the movie. So that I find that's an interesting, and there's some interesting writers of that period. Ursula Parrott is one whose novel Ex-Wife has come back and been pretty well celebrated, because Marcia Gordon has written a biography of Ursula Parrott, who was a fascinating woman. But there were a lot of others, Vigna Del Mar, Catherine Brush, Faith Baldwin, just a remarkable series of writers who were extremely commercially successful and popular and not junk, I would say. I'm not interested in because they're junk, but so that's kind of I've got to still figure out, as you can see, I haven't perfected my elevator speech of that.
No, I, no, I'm glad you haven't perfected it, because that was just the kind of thing I wanted to hear. Faith Baldwin was one of those writers. That is a little bit of a shock.
I mean, yeah, she was, I would say quality wise, she's on the bleeding edge of the spectrum of formulaic, workmanlike prose, junk stuff, because she
And
produced phenomenal rate and for decades.
yeah, yes. And did the studios then bring in, like William Faulkner wrote for the movies, and of course, um, you know, F. Scott Fitzgerald wrote for the movies. We know all about that.
There were many who, came out to Hollywood and stuck their toe in the water and said, thanks, but I'm happy with my life on the East Coast, and I can make
Right.
plenty of money, and I'm not going to do that. But they're happy to sell the film rights, but they let somebody else do the adaptation.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Listen, we have to hurry up and finish this so you could get to work on that book. I think that's a fascinating idea.
I don't see anybody has kind of followed that thread. Uh,
No.
and the studios had literary editors who were sitting in New York just ferociously reading books and writing reports and buying properties because they were so desperate for material, and the cycle was so fast. So like two of the best known actors and terrific actors and actresses from that time, Joan Blondell and James Cagney, were appearing in a play actually based on a German story, but it was a play um, it was appearing on Broadway called Penny Arcade, and it was picked up as a property, and it came out like 6 months later with the two of them. It was both of their first screen appearances in a movie called Sinner's Alley. And yeah, I mean, it just like that was cycle was happening all the time.
I just finished recently reading a novel called The Original, which is looks at a particular period in Katharine Hepburn's life. And I think that it's a novel that you would not be disappointed in. It's pretty wonderful because it's that period in a way. And one of the things that I didn't know is that the Philadelphia story was a play.
Yeah, Philip Berry.
And yes, and that Howard Hughes bought it for Katharine Hepburn, and that's what was her comeback film. So that all fits in so well. Oh, Brad, you must do that. All right. So with your neglected books, writing about those books and choosing some books to be reprinted, do you have some interesting ones coming up?
Yeah, I'll probably let me highlight one that won't come out until next year, and it's going to be a real bear to produce. This is a book I came across. I spend a ridiculous amount of time looking at old book reviews in newspapers and magazines and things like that. And as I said, it's often not the one that says this is a great novel that catches my eye.
Right.
I mean, sometimes it's sort of like this is an odd way to write a book, which sort of sets off my spidey sense, so to speak. The So I was looking and I saw this, and I want to say it was like an Indianapolis newspaper. It was about a professor who was giving a talk in say 37 and 38, something like that, about the great novels of World War One. And he mentions, or it's mentioned in that article, that his assessment of the best American novel of World War One was Mary Lee's It's a Great War. And I went, huh? I mean, I actually studied the literature of World War One when I was an undergraduate, and I thought I knew it pretty well.
Right.
There have been numerous books written about, Paul Fussell's The Great War in Modern Memory is
Yeah.
one of the best, works of
Yeah.
sort of historical criticism around. And it just completely drew a blank. And I looked into it and I found out that it was this novel written by an American woman who had gone over with the YWCA to run canteens for the GIs, for the doughboys, and written a novel that came out in 29. And it was actually considered for the Pulitzer Prize, but the Pulitzer Prize committee backed off because they were a little bit, there was sort of pressure from the American Legion not to push, because it's candid about the reality of war and the fact that not all of our soldiers were great heroes, and that it was an ugly, experience. And so I tracked it down. It's quite a long novel, so it's like 600 pages long.
Ooh, wow.
Highly impressionistic prose. So there's lots of ellipses in it, but very much stream of consciousness as it's experienced by this woman who is clearly a fictional counterpart for Mary Lee, the author. But it's vivid and it's compelling, and you don't feel like, oh my gosh, this 600 pages. You're just it's such an in the moment kind of book. It is so terrific. uh, and so it came out in 29. In 30 it got good reviews, certainly was considered for the Pulitzer, but it just fell off the face of the earth. It's been out of print since 1930, and virtually nobody knows about it. And so we're going to bring that one back. And I think it's a good example of the kinds of books that we're looking for, or I look for the Recovered Book series, which is first and foremost, it's a well-written, well-constructed book. It's a compelling read. It's a contemporary reader can pick it up and not feel like they're slogging through an outdated, archaic text. It's also something that fills what I would call a hole in the jigsaw puzzle. And I know you're a big jigsaw puzzle fan. You
Indeed.
know, the I look at many of these things that we're doing as filling missing pieces in the jigsaw puzzle of literature. That the impression that the stuff that you can find in print, the stuff that's covered in the surveys of literature, that's all there is such a misleading idea.
Is there a biographer, Brad, that you always turn to with great anticipation and are never disappointed?
Well, Robert Caro, let's face it. I
Yeah.
mean,
Yeah.
he's incredible. The research, I think there are many others. I mean, a series that I would love to see come back is the series that Van Wyck Brooks did in the 30s and 40s and 50s. I think it was called Makers and Finders, or the flowering of New England, New England summer. That is such a tapestry of American literature throughout the 19th century. Really remarkable book that I still keep one of the volumes by my bedside for the when I can't sleep in the middle of the night to pull it up, because it's always so
Yeah.
interesting.
I was thinking about William Manchester's series about Churchill, right? I think that's maybe even still in print.
And actually, I will say there's an excellent biographer named Ray Boomhauer who's written about a number of journalists. He wrote about Ernie Pyle and several others, but I'm pretty sure he is working on a biography of William Manchester now.
Oh, that would be very interesting. Yeah, go ahead.
Manchester was a novelist, and one of the books I have in my stack here to read is in the 50s. I forget the name of the title of the book, but he wrote a novel of Baltimore and sort of how the numbers racket leads into this whole conspiracy infecting the police and the politicians, et cetera. And it's to me, when I heard about it, I thought this is like The Wire in 1950s Baltimore. I got to read
Wow.
this.
Oh, that's, yeah. I know, I feel the same way about all of these lost books as you do. And, the idea that it doesn't, that we should look for good reads, just solid good reads that are nicely written. And when we think about why people aren't reading, or are they reading, or what are they reading, I often think that we underestimate what people would read if they knew about the books.
Yeah, I mean, one of the reasons I'm passionate about what we're doing with the Recovered Books series is that, I've been writing about neglected books for 20 years. I have this website. I think I do a decent job, but frankly, it hasn't met bupkis for, it hasn't changed the literary world in any way. Putting a book in print makes such an overnight difference. When people can get it, frankly, one click away or find
Right.
it in their local bookstore, they're going to read it. If the book is something you have to get through interlibrary loan, which I love interlibrary loan,
Yeah,
and I think it's one of
right.
the greatest things on the planet. But the truth is, 99 people out of 100 will shy away from the idea of ever requesting something
Yeah.
through interlibrary loan.
Right. Brad, I do wish we could talk longer, because I feel like we could go on and just be book people together. I would love that. And I do hope when you come back to Seattle, we could get together in person and talk books. And thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you for inviting me. It was wonderful.